You don't need to look into the camera.
Okay.
Unless you want to, unless you really, really want to make a point and you're like, "Arr." No, you don't have to.
I don't anticipate that.
Hi, welcome to Can't Unread, the podcast about the texts and ideas that change us. Today, I am joined by a fellow philosophy student and general cool person, Sarah Rose Ezelle, to talk about Kwame Anthony Appiah's, did I get that right, or is it Appiah?
I think Appiah, yeah.
Appiah's article, What Will Future Generations Condemn Us For? Hi, Sarah Rose. How are you?
Hi, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
I'm doing pretty well. I'm a little nervous, but I'm excited.
That's okay. I'm the host, and I'm also nervous. It's totally fine. So, yes, we are in a semi-ethics-based class together right now.
Yes.
And this article that we picked, or that you specifically picked that I thought was really cool, is about ethics. And before we get into it, I just wanted to ask you what interests you about ethics in general.
I read this in Robin Zabrowski's Intro to Philosophy class, and I think it might have been the first ethics-related text that we covered. And I just thought it was really fascinating. And I think as I've taken more ethics and just gotten a little more familiar with it, it's probably my favorite part of philosophy because I think it's something that I thought about a lot before I ever took any philosophy or any ethics, without recognizing that I was thinking about ethics, because it's just such a part of everyone's everyday life, and I think everyone thinks about it without necessarily having the formal frameworks. So reading about it and learning about it more has been really interesting.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've had some similar thoughts, and I've really struggled with some of the intuitive aspects of ethics. A lot of ethics arguments will start with a premise. That's just we believe this, it's wrong to kill a person.
Right, right.
And then building off of those intuitive premises, you start to make a particular argument. If you don't agree with those premises, the argument just kind of doesn't work.
Exactly.
But I've honestly kind of come to terms with it because I think it's, really fascinating how important intuition is in morality, and how we have to accept that, a lot of our reasoning is kind of faith-based, and then we work off of those common conceptions and make an argument. So, yeah, it's, cool and bad.
Yes, exactly.
Anyway, so, Appiah. Yes, Appiah.
Appiah, yes, I think. I'm not the authority, but yes.
Yeah, so we were looking for a pronunciation of his name, and it took us, we both researched this individually and couldn't find it. Anyway, but Appiah, if you listen to this for some reason, which would be really cool, we hope we got it right. He wants to pin down what, as he says directly, future generations will condemn us for. Practices that seem standard now, but that we'll look back on as having been wrong or obviously wrong. And what interested you about this specific article? You talked a little bit about how you felt like it was really applicable, but is there anything else?
That's kind of it. I think this is something that I had kind of thought about, not quite in these terms before. Just thinking about the concept of moral progress, sort of telling a progress narrative. I think this article is really approachable in that it just lays out the three criteria really blatantly, and then it's also something that I think it's really easy to run through practices that we engage in now and see whether they apply, which kind of leads into one of the not problems I have with the article, but one of the things that I have in mind when I think about it is that the three criteria are pretty broad. And I think there's a lot of practices you could apply them to. There's room for dispute about whether they apply to a lot of practices we engage in now.
Yeah, for sure. So let's go over those criteria.
Yes.
The first one is people have already heard the arguments against the practice. With things that are very strictly wrong, the arguments are they sort of emerge cyclically. They come about, people argue against them, and then they come about again in vaguely different ways. The second criterion, I think that's the singular of criteria, is that defenders of the custom tend not to offer moral counter-arguments, but instead invoke tradition, human nature, or necessity. Of course, course, I think it's interesting that he automatically discounts tradition, human nature, and necessity as not being inherently moral.
Yes.
But the example he gives that I think is pretty strong is just like, we've always had slaves. How could we grow cotton without them? It basically has nothing to do with the ethics. It's just this kind of short-sighted view of necessity. The very last criterion is that, quote, supporters engage in what one might call strategic ignorance. I thought this was really interesting. Avoiding truths that might force them to face the evils in which they're complicit. In general, do you feel like you agree with these criteria?
I think so, yeah. I think I do agree with the criteria, and I think sort of a wall that I come up against is something he mentions, which is that it's really hard to tell in real time what is just a disputed practice and what is something that will be pretty much universally condemned in the future. There are so many issues right now that, like, I personally think that those things apply to, but someone on the opposite side of the political spectrum could have opposite opinions. And so I think, like, he kind of avoids that. The criterion that supporters of the practice use non-moral defenses is really strong, because that kind of sidesteps that a little bit.
Yeah. I have mixed feelings about this strategic ignorance argument, because I feel like, especially from a political standpoint, there's facts and then other facts. Now, obviously, I believe that the facts on my side are the correct ones.
Right.
But straight up strategic ignorance doesn't always lend itself to some of the political complexity. Not necessarily that there's an argument for moderation to be made, but the people on different sides of the political spectrum are really fed different information. Even if you're trying to think critically, it's really hard to get the right information. So I think that what he might call strategic ignorance might be our intuitions and what we've been taught, and really not knowing what's accurate.
And I think, like, part of what, I think he might even give this specific example. One of the practices that he predicts will be condemned is the industrial meat production. As a meat eater, like, if I see like a PETA video come up on my Facebook or whatever that shows piglets being stuffed into some terrible confinement, I don't know, situation, I scroll right past. That's definitely a form of strategic ignorance that I, like, myself, and I think a lot of other people engage in, at least in those ways. My sophomore year, I took environmental ethics with Professor Chris Frakes, and then I took food ethics with her the next semester. And it's kind of, meat eating is kind of an unavoidable topic in both of those classes, sort of in environmental ethics from the angle of treatment of animals, treatment of people who work to produce like factory farmed meat, treatment of the environment in general. Like my sophomore year, that's when I had kind of an ethical like dilemma about my own like meat eating.
The reckoning.
Yeah, it was the reckoning a little bit. There were like 3 people in that class maybe out of like 20 who ate meat. And I kind of was like, oh, like, or, oh no, like,
you're good.
Yeah. And so I had like a really hard time with that. And I tried to go vegetarian, and my backbone was not strong enough. It didn't happen for me. I know that from pretty much every ethical standpoint, the strongest argument to be made in regards to meat eating is that it's unethical.
Yeah.
And it's still something I do. By taking those classes, I wasn't really able to like engage in the same strategic ignorance. Like I kind of took the blinds down, and then I still kept doing it.
That's something that I struggle with ethics. You will see a very good argument and logically agree with it and not do the thing.
Yes.
I
think that's called acrosia, Matt was telling us.
A weakness of the will, yes.
Weakness of the will, yeah. Yes.
I love how there are these, and I believe that's Greek. Yes, that's Greek.
I think so, yeah.
There are these wonderful terms for these, the horrible things that people do, like acrosia.
Yes.
I'm a failure. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think about that so much because I basically feel the same way about veganism. I was raised vegetarian, so it's not difficult for me, but I think I should be vegan, and I am not. If everyone had a very good and clear argument that they were presented with to not do something, I don't know if they would, and that's something I struggle with so much with ethics.
I think that's definitely true. And like I kind of, when I'm like justifying meat eating to myself, I kind of am like, oh well, like I was like in Beloit in the winter and I was really hungry, and the tofu at Commons was really badly prepared. And then I'm like, okay, I'm like so leaning on that like non-moral argument as a justification.
Yeah, it does bring up the issue of to what extent do we have a moral responsibility to engage or not engage in certain behaviors? Because like the semi-cynic but also weirdly empathetic part of me says that humans are flawed, and that hypocrisy is okay, and as long as we pick some battles, we'll be better as a species, and you can't expect people to be as morally astute as we perhaps would like them to be. I don't know if astute is the right word, upright or whatever. That sounds kind of like a bit of a utilitarian leaning framework, maybe. Yeah, I could see that. I wasn't thinking about that specifically, but I think you could look at a way to like maximize the good that people do while still being forgiving,
while allowing for like other
and you could try to like create a moral framework with particular rules that essentially everyone could get behind because it allows for those flaws, and maybe that would be better than laying out the ideal.
Yeah, I think definitely a problem I have with ethics is that a lot of like Kantianism in its purest form relies a lot on like moral purity, and there's no room for intuition or mistakes or like anything like that, and I think that turns a lot of people away. And I think it does kind of make ethics like appear or come off as like
an ideal, sort of
like an ideal that like you can kind of aspire to, but like it's not something you can really put into practice in your everyday life super easily.
Not to put you on the spot, but do you think you could give like a brief overview of Kantianism for people who don't know what it is?
So Kant, his big thing was the categorical imperative, which is the idea that you can't grant yourself permission to do things that you would not universally agree are okay. So like you can't decide it's okay for you to steal if you can't agree that it's okay then if everyone in the world steals. And Kant cares a lot more about intention than outcome, I guess. And so his whole thing is that you have to do good in order to do good, not to get anything else out of it, not for any further end.
So the specific examples that Appiah gave of things that would be condemned by future generations, which first of all I think is interesting because we're almost in that future generation since this was written, I think about a decade or 10 years ago. Were the prison system, industrialized meat production, which we obviously just had a cool discussion about, the institutionalized elderly, and the environment. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on those other examples, or if you thought that maybe opinion on these has changed since the article was published.
Sure, yeah. I think to address the second question, if I think opinion has changed, that's kind of hard for me to answer because 10 years ago I was 11, so I wasn't like hugely politically or socially aware. Like I think I would be inclined to say yes, because like in the last 10 years has kind of been when I've been becoming aware of social issues and these types of things. But for someone who was like fully fledged a decade ago, like they might have a very different answer. But
well, that represents your progress, even if it doesn't represent the progress of humanity.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, I think they're really good examples, but I also think something that it doesn't pay a ton of attention to is the fact that like our prison system and the environment and factory farming are all huge and very necessary parts of capitalism.
Right, yeah, I had that same thought.
In order for future generations to widely condemn these things, we're going to need to strongly move away from capitalism.
There's sort of this implication that individuals can just change this, and that would be the opposite of, or that would be a proof of condemnation. But yes, go on.
Right, so yeah, I mean, it's kind of and there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. And of course, like I'm saying that as someone who kind of has inclinations towards moving away from capitalism. But someone who is benefiting from all these things, and for whom like capitalism is a system that really works.
Really floats their boat.
Like they would disagree, and they might like on the face of it say, yeah, factory farming is bad. But when it comes down to it, how else would we produce meat in the same way where it reaches so many people at such a low price, and people, like a few people at the top, benefit so highly from it.
Right.
And the same is with the prison system. Like, prison labor is a huge part of the economy. And I think there are going to be like big changes that need to happen in order for future generations to like strongly condemn these things as much as we now condemn. Like, the examples he's giving are beating your wife and children or homosexuality as a hanging offense. Like,
yeah,
I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the interim that he does not address, which I understand is not the point of the article. But
no, I think those are really good points. And sometimes I wonder if there's this kind of incorrect implication, like, once again, putting a lot of pressure on individuals to make particular changes, when it's really more the responsibility of a larger system. And yet, we know that we're a part of that larger system. I would say that,
Definitely.
like, with something like systemic racism, I think that we all have a responsibility to try and alter that and challenge our own biases and the way that we act. So if you're just like, well, that's a systemic problem, like, you're part of the system.
Right. That's kind of like when you look at how abolition came about, it was because of the really devoted work of some abolitionists.
Right, yeah.
So it's kind of the same. I think looking at history is a really good way to like think about how change happens, because it is very disheartening to think about the fact that like CEOs aren't suddenly going to have a realization that what they're doing is wrong. But like, I think it really is like grassroots organizing that has worked in the past, and that probably, in my opinion, will be what makes significant change in the future.
Yeah, I'm totally down for that. I won't get into this too much, but I really thought that grassroots stuff was not super effective until I had an internship with a political organization, and I was like, hey, like, you can make change. Obviously, it's more nuanced than that. It's really difficult, but that was, that was inspiring, and I do have more faith in that kind of thing now.
For sure.
I am definitely afraid of being on the wrong side of history. When I look at a particular issue and I'm like, well, it's not really my responsibility, or like, my life is hard. I'm like, would I have been that person, like, not getting involved in abolition?
Exactly.
I have those concerns, and I was wondering if you have thoughts like that, or had anything to say about that kind of thing.
Yeah, I share those concerns. And I think it could be kind of an interesting approach, like kind of a persuasive tactic, when you're trying to like convince people to, like, people who are already in the same sort of share the same mindset as you, but who are hesitant to get involved in like organizing, or people who are on the opposite of the political spectrum. Like, I wonder if, not scaring people, but like the idea that like you don't want to be on the wrong side of history. And I think sometimes you can look at things and think it probably will be condemned in the future. And like, even people who are engaging in those practices might be able to be like, oh God, like, I'm doing that. Like, I wonder if that would be an effective, persuasive tactic.
This is such a hard issue. I think sometimes if you think someone's profoundly wrong and you're like, hey, like, this is the equivalent of you endorsing slavery or whatever, and they don't get it, they'd be like, bro, what the like,
exactly,
it just create more of a divide as opposed to
escalation.
creating sort of, I guess, civil discourse. But at the same time, I think those types of, I'd say emotions, but I mean, there's reason behind them, can be really useful. So that's difficult. I was wondering if there were some practices beyond the ones that were mentioned that you think will be condemned.
Yeah, I had a couple ideas for that. I struggled with separating practices that I think should be condemned now and practices that I think will actually be universally condemned in the future. But what I have is our privatized healthcare system.
Right.
I think it kind of hits all three like criteria. Like, as far as I know, there's not really a moral defense.
There would probably be some
healthcare.
kind of like capitalistic trickle down skewed argument there.
Probably.
But yeah.
But I think a lot of the defenses of it are kind of like practical or like,
right.
And then I think, there are a lot of vocal critics of it, definitely. And strategic ignorance, I can't speak to that directly, but I think that a lot of people who support privatized healthcare in the way that we have it now are not spending a lot of time thinking about people who are completely unable to get healthcare, or who get really sick when they're 23 and then are in debt for the rest of their life, paying off their medical bills.
That's a great point, and I'm actually a little surprised he didn't mention that.
Yeah.
Maybe he saw it as more of a politicized issue for some reason and decided not to mention it.
Maybe. And I think another thing that makes me think maybe it won't be universally condemned in the future is that England has always had, not always, but for a long time has had the NHS.
Yeah.
And now there's a huge movement to privatize the NHS, and it's gaining a lot of traction, and it looks like it might actually start to happen, which interferes with the progress narrative a little bit.
Yeah, it's really hard to accept that, and I'm not sure if Appiah accepts this, that general moral thought may just sway in the other direction.
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe he's a little too optimistic thinking that won't happen, although I guess maybe if you believe that we make moral progress, he might be talking about the long term.
Yeah.
Like, with issues in the past, we see them sway back and forth, but maybe, over the course of a couple hundred years, we see a particular direction.
You might be right on that, because he talks about abolition, and he talks about waterboarding in the Catholic Church, and, well, that's not that long ago. But, like, those types of things are much further removed than, like, 2010.
I had this sort of specific thought about things that would be condemned. I was actually thinking about changing beauty standards. We'll sort of condemn a particular practice, like, why are people dieting this much to lose weight? Or why were people getting these types of surgeries in this culture at this point?
Right.
But then a new standard will emerge and people start getting implants and Botox and stuff. And definitely not saying that those are inherently wrong, though I think there are lots of problems with them. I don't know if there's, at least if you think if beauty standards can be dangerous, if there's exactly progress being made there. It's just like it just keeps changing, you know what I'm saying?
It does keep changing, yeah. And I think that there's a lot of debate about the value of choice versus like paternalism, and just kind of a lot of like, well, like it's a woman's right to choose if she wants to get breast implants, even if they could be dangerous to her in the future. And there's a lot of arguments to be made on both sides, I think. Yeah, that is an interesting one, how there is kind of a progress narrative being told, even though there are still disputed practices that people engage in. Yeah,
and it depends. I don't want to say they're all inherently bad if you want to change something about your body, but it's definitely a thing.
Yeah, it is.
I definitely struggle with, I guess what I would call choice feminism, but I think there's an important distinction where I could be like, you know what, I think you should consider the circumstances of this choice more, but it doesn't mean that I don't think you should have the right to choose. I think sometimes people, and kind of rightfully so, will look at choice feminism and be like, well, like, why is it that everyone can just do whatever they want with no criticism? But I think an important part is that there should be criticism. It's just like the choice is more important.
Right. And I think a lot of like choice feminism is in direct response to the way that women have not been given choices about what to do with their bodies or whatever. Yeah,
we should do a different episode about this. I love this topic.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on practices that we think are bad today that won't be condemned in the future?
Ooh. I think like plural marriage is an interesting one. And I think it's outlawed now because it has a really patriarchal past and relates to the idea that like women can be like sort of owned. But I think that there's like definitely on the rise and definitely becoming normalized is like polyamorous relationships or romantic relationships that involve more than two people. And so I wonder if that is going to work its way into kind of the collective conscious. I don't know.
Yeah. I think that's a great example that we're kind of conditioned in a way to be monogamous in our culture, and maybe that's changing. Now, I'm still biased because I feel profoundly monogamous, and I think some people always will be.
I do too, and I that's not a super like fleshed out thought, but I definitely have been seeing like more stuff online about sort of improving the rights of polyamorous people or thruples or like people who
love the term thruple.
I love thruple too. Yeah. So I do wonder if that will like, I don't imagine that in like the next like 10 or 20 years becoming a huge thing, but like maybe further along.
Okay, this is a hard question. It's a hard question for me too, but I was wondering if you had thoughts on your own moral system if you feel like you have a developed moral system, not that I think most people do, or, you know, strong values, stuff like that guide your life.
I kind of have a problem where I read like a paper and I'm like, oh yeah, that adds up. And then I'll just like, and then I'll read something that directly opposes it. And I'm like, that makes sense. Yeah. And so I've had a really hard time settling on, like, I wouldn't call myself like a Kantian or like a utilitarian or anything like that. But I think that my inclinations lie more towards Kantianism than any type of like consequentialism. And that, like, I don't even know if I can even say that, though, because I'm not sure, like, how widely I could apply that to my own life. But I think my intuitions lie there more.
I think that's really cool. I don't know if I know that many people who call themselves Kantians.
Well, yeah. And I feel like there's a lot of, like, explaining that needs to be done in order to, like, redeem, like, my view of Kant, which we probably don't have time for now. But yeah, I don't mean Kant in like the like straightforward, like what Kant himself like used his theory for. That I don't really subscribe to that, but like more modern iterations of it.
I think about this a lot. Sometimes I wonder if sort of our descriptions of what we believe are kind of justifications as opposed to systems that we actually follow. Yes. It sounds like this might not be fully the case for you. You sound like you got a fleshed out idea of what's up. But maybe. Definitely for, I don't know, for me, I feel like a problem that I have that's a very common human problem that like really rhymed is that I will rationalize things as opposed to living by a particular code of conduct. And, you know, I think that's one of the issues with trying to follow a particular moral system. I think it's often used as a justification, or simply that human morality is a little more complex than that, and sometimes it is adaptive. Like, oftentimes when we make decisions, we're not necessarily drawing upon our particular framework that we would like verbalize that we agree with.
Yes.
You know, we're bundles of heuristics, but that can also be adaptive. I think about that and it hurts me.
And I think, like when applying it to like your personal life or like relationships between people, it also is interesting because I think for me, like thinking about like different ethical frameworks gives like an interesting lens to sort of like view interpersonal problems through. But I also don't think, like, I think it would be kind of like unhinged to be like, I'm going to approach this breakup from like a Kantian angle or something. Like, I think that's
I endorse that. That's great.
And I don't take it that far, but I think it is interesting just as a way to like help you think about your actions.
You just like write them like, several paragraphs of text where you're just like, I just wanted to let you know, I'm I think you did this wrong from a Kantian standpoint. It wouldn't be good for each other because of the categorical imperative in this way.
Yes.
Yeah. Another thing I was thinking about is I'm not actually that familiar with this, but George Lakoff studies essentially morality in the brain.
Okay.
And he's talked about how the reason why we can hold so many contradicting opinions in different situations, like, you know, in one case I'd advocate for this thing, but in this other situation I'd advocate for the opposite, is because we literally have like different neuronal structures, like pathways that are activated in those situations. Yeah, I think it's fascinating, but kind of sad because it means we have some stuff to overcome if we want to be self-consistent.
Definitely, yeah. And I wonder like how much kind of that can be like relied on as an excuse, like kind of from having moral inconsistencies.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. I struggle between like excuse versus I guess I want to say empathy for humans being shit, because they are. I think a lot of times to make moral decisions we have to overcome parts of ourselves, which is rough.
Definitely, yes.
So the last question I had for you was Appiah. He talks about practices that will be condemned, but he doesn't really talk about how we're going to put an end to those practices. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that issue.
I kind of am at a bit of a loss with that. Like, I think there needs to be a lot of organizing at an individual level, and I also think that there needs to be a lot of accountability at a higher level.
Yeah, for sure.
I know I'm saying really vague things.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense.
It kind of, that's kind of what I can come up with for that. And I think also the knowledge that like, that we could be and probably are like living through something that future generations will find morally reprehensible, like should serve as a motivator to kind of act for like what we believe in and kind of like, I don't know, to like speak up about things that we think are unjust. Yeah.
And I actually think our generation is doing a pretty good job of that. That's all I have, unless there's anything in particular that we didn't cover that you wanted to talk about.
No, I think, those questions were awesome. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I thought that was like a really great conversation.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Thank you for having me.
So that was Sarah Rose. We talked about Appiah's article, What Future Generations Will Condemn Us For. Thank you for listening, and tune in next week. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did it.